This is an NBC News special report. Here's Hallie Jackson.
We are coming on the air here in Washington moments after the president's primetime address on election integrity, where the president described information he says is now declassified related to allegations of voter fraud and cover-ups, including accusing China of acquiring 220 million U.S. voter files in what he calls the largest compromise of election data in history. Keep in mind, voter files are publicly available materials. And while our reporting teams are still combing through the specifics of these documents, the core of what the president is referencing in these allegations are largely not new. Here's more of what the president said.
The documents cover 5 major areas of concern. First, they show that over a period of years, starting during the 2020 election cycle, the People's Republic of China carried out what is believed to be the largest compromise of election data in history, resulting in China's illicit acquisition of 220 million U.S. voter files. That information includes names, addresses, phone numbers, political party preferences, and other sensitive data that would be needed to register to vote and engage in other nefarious activities, which is exactly what was happening. This data loss presents an unprecedented election security nightmare. The intelligence even shows that China has signed a data exploitation unit specifically to this new project. Compounding the travesty, the second set of documents we are releasing reveals that members of the deep state, very, very famous group of people, in many cases, in our intelligence agency work to actively suppress and downplay information about the extent of China's sinister election meddling, covering it up from both the president and the American people like nobody thought was possible.
Let me bring in now our chief White House correspondent, Garrett Haake, who is joining us from the North Lawn. And Garrett, President Trump previously for years had pushed conspiracy theories about election fraud. So bring us up to speed tonight. What did he say, if anything, that was new?
Hallie, broadly speaking, much of this would sound familiar to people who followed the president. He described the U.S. election system as falling, in his words, catastrophically short of the standards we should have for election security, and described a declassification and review of American election records that broadly fell into several categories, including that obtaining of voter information by China. Another category as relates to activities that were taking place in Venezuela. A third category on cover-ups, and a fourth on domestic, let's call them voter irregularities, including a focus specifically on one GOTV group in Michigan. He concluded with a line, I don't know whether it was scripted or ad-lib, saying that stolen elections cannot happen again. But never did he use the data he was presenting to make a case that any specific election was stolen, merely that there were these categories of vulnerabilities. He concluded with a push to pass the Save America Act, a piece of legislation that would overhaul parts of the voting system in this country, namely requiring voter ID and proof of citizenship to both register and to vote, casting that as a prescription. But again, the prescription didn't exactly match up with the complaints that the president outlined throughout the course of this. As you said, Hallie, hundreds of pages of documents here released by the White House with information we still have to review to find what exactly is new and what's supported by other information publicly available.
And our team's looking through it. Garrett, thanks, including our national security and global affairs reporter, Dan DeLuce. And Dan, one of the questions people will ask, was there anything revealed by the president? Is there anything in these documents that would have changed any actual vote count?
I didn't hear that in that speech. He talked about China not wanting him to get elected. He talked about them getting a hold of this voter data. But I didn't hear him, and I haven't seen in these documents so far, some kind of indication that China or another foreign actor penetrated our voting system, got into a state's election counting system, tampered with ballots. He didn't talk about that. I don't see it yet in the documents. He's not even really alleging that. So I think the case is still out there. As far as we know, and there's such overwhelming evidence, Joe Biden won that election. And he's also not making clear what should be done now exactly, because he's talked about the federal government should take over the process. But he kind of left that open in that speech.
Let me go to our chief Capitol Hill correspondent, Ryan Nobles, who's joining us now. This speech was controversial even before it began, with some of the president's critics suggesting he is trying to sow doubt about the legitimacy of American elections just months before the midterms. And in his own party, questions about why this message now.
Yeah, that's right. I think there are many Republicans that would prefer a speech like this with as big of an audience that the president had be focused on things like affordability, the price of gas, kitchen table issues that affect millions of Americans and will largely drive what they are going to decide when they go to the ballot box. Instead, he's pushing a ballot measure that largely is unpopular with both Republicans and Democrats in the Save America Act. It doesn't have the votes to pass. It probably still will not have the votes to pass after this speech, despite what the president tried to present here tonight.
And very quickly, Kelly O'Donnell, we also heard the president nod to some of the political realities at the very top of that speech.
He certainly did, and acknowledging that there are other considerations in terms of what's going on with Iran, talking about the economy. One of the prescriptions he said going forward is he wants to work with states to strengthen their various voting capabilities. And he's also asking his own Department of Justice to investigate.
Kelly, Ryan, Dan, thank you. Our thanks to Garrett Hake as well. And to all of you for watching. For now, that concludes this NBC News special report. We'll have a lot more ahead coming up on NBC News Daily, on our streaming network, NBC News Now, and online at NBCnews.com. Join us on our streaming channel for further coverage. I'm Hallie Jackson. We'll see you soon.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.